والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أجمعين وبعد. Today we have with us Dr. Arnold Yasin, and I'll briefly introduce him before he gives his talk. Arnold Yasin is PhD Fellow and Lecturer in Islamic Studies and Arabic Philosophy at Leiden University Institute for Philosophy. And he's a researcher in Islamic Intellectual History at the Leiden University Center for the Study of Religion. He's a member of the Leiden University Shia Studies Initiative. He's also a lecturer in Comparative Theology and Philosophy of Religion at the Islamic University of Applied Sciences, Rotterdam, and Senior Research Consultant at LSE, Dutch National Center for Extremism. He has multiple publications on the subject of Islamic intellectual history, Islamic theology, tafsir studies, hadith studies, Islamic ethics, Islam and human rights, Islamic reformism and extremism, and has provided talks, consultations, and lectures at multiple non-governmental organizations, international institutes, and conferences, including Freiburg University, Georgetown, Oxford, Hisar in Istanbul, and Oxford University, and the Dutch Theological Society. He teaches at the Institute for Philosophy in subjects such as Islamic thought, Arabic philosophy, and philosophy of religions and worldviews. And his talk today will be on the Ḥanafī-Māturīdī as an Islamic worldview orientation. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you for Dr. Qasim and Sheikh Amin for inviting me for this talk. What I want to do today is not simply to have an historical introduction into the Hanafi-Maturidi as a school, but more explain how I personally ended up in orientating towards this perspective in Islamic thought, both from a personal perspective as a Muslim, as a convert, but also as from a research perspective, as an academic, an intellectual historian of Islam. I've been engaging with Sheikh Amin for a couple of years now. I've been blessed with personal engagement with him, being a student of him in different settings. And so we've discussed this a lot, how I, both as an academic and as a faith adherent of Islam, as being Muslim, was drawn towards the Hanafi-Maturidi perspective, the orientation, and what were my reasons for that. And Sheikh Amin asked me if I could explain that through a talk like this, in a way how I view, how I may distinguish the Hanafi-Maturidi perspective from an academic perspective and a personal perspective from all the other orientations within the Islamic worldview. So one of the things that I have been teaching for a while now is different ideas about philosophy of religion, the study of the comparative religion, and how from an Islamic perspective you can understand Islam itself as a worldview, but also how it differentiates, it is distinct from other worldviews, and how from Islamic theology these different type of distinctions were developed and constructed. And in this way, I originally developed this perspective mainly for my non-Muslim students at Leiden University, who were, for the majority, had a secular background and who had difficulties in understanding religion as a worldview, as a system of thought. And so what I did originally was to develop this idea for them, to explain them how a religion is a specific kind of worldview, how it differs from secular worldviews, and how you can research, analyze a complex worldview as Islam with its multiple schools of thought, its very diverse, multicultural perspectives, because from an outsider it's very difficult to look in. As a convert, I know this difficulty. Apart from before I was Muslim, it was very difficult to understand how to look into Islam and understand exactly what it is made up of. It's very difficult to simply zoom in on a certain perspective as Aqidah, as the different theological dogmas or specific elements of its teachings. Most converts are convert because of experiences, certain social experiences with interactions with people of the faith, certain interactions with special aspects of the faith. Like my personal experience was with the Quran itself, a Quran translation, and how the scripture of Islam drew me into Islam. There are other converts that were drawn into Islam because they had positive experiences with other Muslims, because they had a positive experience within a Muslim country, hearing the adhan, seeing Muslims pray in the mosque. It is these type of, so converts have very different ways of entering into, being drawn into the Islamic worldview. So there are very different pathways into Islam, and therefore it's also very difficult to simply, from the outside perspective, simply to understand Islam as a worldview, the complexity of it. But also when I converted to Islam, alhamdulillah, about 20 years, more than 20 years ago now, one of the things as well that during that conversion process, it was very difficult to navigate within Islam because it's a large worldview. It has many schools of thought. It had very different cultural perspectives, which gave identity towards different ways of being Muslim. So as a convert, it's very difficult to navigate the Islamic worldview. And I started also to understand that this was also difficult for many Muslims, especially in the West, because they become more and more detached from the cultural and ethnic identities of Islam. I was engaging with Turkish Muslims, with Moroccan Muslims, for example, here in Holland, with Pakistani, Indian, and Afghan Muslims in the UK, Somali Muslims, and more, especially with people from younger generations, they start to see themselves more as Muslim and less as, for example, being Moroccan or being Turkish. Sorry, my son in the back specifically wants to be on camera. So I started to see more and more how difficult it was also for many Muslims in the West themselves who were growing up as a minority within the West, within Europe and Northern America, how as a minority they became more and more detached from the cultural identity of their parents and grandparents, and how difficult it was to reformulate their Muslim identity from this sort of double cultural identity as partially being a cultural Muslim, and at the same time creating this new cultural identity as being a British Muslim or an American Muslim, or for example me and a lot of other Muslims here in Holland as a Dutch Muslim. So the difficulty I had as a convert to navigate the Islamic worldview, the difficulties is for non-Muslims to engage the Islamic worldview. Also, a lot of Muslims in modernity as minorities in the West, but also even more and more as majorities in Muslim majority countries. With the difficulty of navigating modernity itself, the modern times, contemporary times. I started to understand how the complexity of Islam is both, of course, a rahma, it is a mercy, but also it can be very much a burden for a lot of Muslims. So I hope to start to create a sort of map, a roadmap to understand the Islamic worldview itself. So this talk itself is not specifically only simply to zoom in on the Hanafi-Maturidi as an orientation within the Islamic worldview, but more how I personally ended up within the Hanafi-Maturidi perspectives, and how that is an example of how you can navigate within the Islamic worldview, but also what you need to create a healthy form of navigation. And this is how I, inshallah, want to end my talk. So I will. I created a PowerPoint slide, which I will upload now. And which has a mix of my slides that I use for my different classes. At Leiden University, but also what I've been teaching at the Islamic University of Rotterdam, where I am also a lecturer and a thesis coordinator. The Islamic University of Rotterdam is a private institution with accredited degrees. So we have an accredited degree in a Bachelor of Islamic Theology, Practical Islamic Theology, and we have a master degree in Islamic Spiritual Care, which is one of the only master programs on Islamic spiritual care that is fully developed from an Islamic perspective, and which is accredited and acknowledged also within the Dutch system of chaplaincy and spiritual care. So I've been using this worldview approach in different way, in different courses, to create this skill set for Muslims to zoom in and zoom out of the Islamic worldview, so they can understand their locality, their positionality within the Islamic tradition, within the Islamic worldview. But also, for example, if they work with people for example, as an Islamic spiritual care worker, as a chaplain, as a theologian, as an imam in a mosque, that the people they have in front of them that, for example, have certain type of questions, that they understand where the questions are coming from, what type of orientations are involved, or what type of orientation are they seeking. So in that kind of way, that the worldview perspective helps people to navigate themselves within the Islamic worldview, but also help others to navigate it. So let me see. Yes. So first of all, we need to understand what is a worldview. So there are several, within philosophy of religion, there are several authorities that have tried to construct this idea. So you have the works of Nagel, Sire, Joseph Ramso, Hendrik Vroom, who's from Holland. And I've used him most because I felt he had the best distinction between a private worldview, a personal worldview, and a worldview tradition as a religion. So let's start from, first of all, the personal perspective. So you have, so Hendrik Vroom, what he does in his work, he starts to build out first from a personal perspective. What is your worldview? So first of all, a personal worldview from an individual perspective, which is shared, of course, by everybody that is alive or was alive, had a worldview, had a personal worldview. They constructed their own worldview. It's their one view on life. So and it's the sum of all the person's insights, all the person's everything, the type of knowledge, experiences, impressions that were gathered up in somebody's life. So part of these come from, for example, if they grew up as a Christian or as a Muslim, a majority of these insights come from the Islamic worldview, from Islam as a religious tradition. But also there are a lot of elements within a personal worldview that are simply experiences, impressions that one had, from traveling, from watching media, from reading also material that are not directly connected to the Islamic worldview or the Christian worldview, etc., etc. So you have this sum of all the person's insight. So it's also not a coherent theory. It is sort of gathering, accumulation of many forms of impressions, insights, experiences, images, types of different forms of information that accumulate in one's life, and whereby somebody's worldview becomes a sort of personal construct. And it's not directly coherent as well. You don't have a full control about how you understand all the impressions that you got in your life, all the insights you had in life, and how they also influence you. This is something we also see in the Islamic tradition, how Ghazali, Rahimullah, Imam Ghazali, discusses how different impressions you get, how things you've heard, things you've seen, how they can leave impressions in you without you fully understanding the impact on you. So, and not everybody, of course, lives completely in conformity with the worldview, because it's very hard, very difficult to fully understand the worldview you're living in, the worldview that comes out of you, because it's very hard to have a deep understanding of, to know oneself. So it is not a developed theory which one applies in life. It's a gathering of insight, and it gives direction, orientation to one's life. It is therefore this combination. So this is the personal worldview that everybody has. And of course, the whole idea of being religious, to conform to religious tradition, is that you try to constantly reorientate yourself towards the perspectives that your tradition gives you. So in a sense, to be orthodox, to be adherent of a religion, to say, I am religious, I am orthodox, I try to be live in conformity to according to religious tradition. Like I say, I try to live accordingly to the Hanafi-Maturidi orientation of Islam. That is, so I constantly tried, not only I need to understand the Hanafi-Maturidi orientations well, but I also need to understand how I am affected by everything that I experienced in life, or the insights that I already have in me, that I carry around as a sort of luggage with me, or or how this how I can constantly how my character and my psychology needs to be constantly corrected by the orientation of the Hanafi-Maturidi, and also when it comes to Tariqat, the Naqshbandi perspective that I adhere to, how I constantly try to understand my ethical and legal concepts through the Hanafi framework, the Hanafi orientation, my theological concepts, and my philosophy to the Maturidi perspective, and my personal spiritual character development to the Naqshbandi orientation. So I'm constantly trying to reorientate my personal worldview through the Hanafi-Maturidi Naqshbandi perspective. And that has been, for me being 20 years Muslims, that has been a very difficult journey to develop this. And that is something I try to explain to you all, how to do this. Please give me 1 second. Okay. So Rome emphasizes that so first of all, if you look at a Muslim, any Muslim, or any Christian, or any atheist, or any Buddhist, first of all, you're looking at somebody who's trying to, or at least in a certain type of awareness. If the person, for example, identifies as a Muslim or as a Christian, that identity is an identity claim that, in a certain way, I try to conform a certain tradition. But technically, the majority of adherents of a religion, as a Muslim or as a Christian or whatever, technically, of course, as Rome emphasizes, and psychology of religion and sociology of religion, and also, of course, if you look at it simply from a personal perspective, if you look at other people around you, it's very difficult for most people to conform their worldview, to conform their traditional worldview. So if you look at a Muslim, technically looking at a Muslim is not the same thing as looking at the worldview itself. And this is something, of course, I also teach my non-Muslim students and my non-Muslim colleagues, but this also applies to, people from to Muslims themselves. When you look at your fellow Muslim, you're not directly looking at a full expression of the Islamic worldview. So there is a difference between the worldview tradition itself as a collective worldview and the way it is acted out. So a Muslim has a personal worldview where Islam can be a dominant factor, a dominant orientation, a dominant perspective within a personal worldview. But most Muslims will have, it is very difficult for them to fully act out the Islamic worldview. This is also one of the reasons why the Islamic tradition created these layers of obligated fards, wajib. So all these different layers of the ahkam, the ahkam al-khamsa, the idea of these layered forms of obligations, it has specifically already shows that Muslim scholars, pre-modern Muslim scholars, were highly aware how difficult it is to live out fully the Islamic worldview. Yeah? How difficult it is for a Muslim to conform the Islamic worldview in the total perspective, in the full perspective. So technically, most Muslims, like most Christians and other people from other religions, we will fail the worldview we claim to adhere to. We will fail it. That can be a type of sinning. That can be a type of lapsing. That can be that you adhere to the minimal obligations, but for example, but it's very hard for most people to fully apply all obligations in Islam and to fully avoid all the things that are forbidden by your worldview. That's very difficult. And therefore, if you look at your fellow Muslims, you have to understand that everybody is simply struggling to fully adhere to the worldview they're in, to live conform the worldview. So there's your worldview and your way of life to make them to make them overlap one another. That your way of life, your walking, your suluk, the way you be a salik, you try to walk through life according to the Islamic worldview. The way you're walking overlaps with the Islamic worldview. That is simply a struggle that will be there for your whole life. Some Muslims, of course, have it more easy than others. It is also very much more difficult from a minority perspective, as Muslim minorities, to fully live out the Islamic worldview than it is for example, Muslims living in majority Muslim settings, where they have mosques all around them, where you don't need to think about halal meat and halal food because it's everywhere around you. There are less temptations most of the times. For example, alcohol will not be there and other forms of drugs will be less available to you. So in a Muslim majority setting, it is easier to adhere to the Islamic worldview, and it's easier to adhere to it, to be successful in it, and it will be also easier not to fail the Islamic worldview. But from a Muslim minority perspective, it is harder to succeed in fulfilling the Islamic worldview in your life, to live conformantly to the Islamic worldview, and it will be easier to fail it. So that is one of the things that Muslims in the West have to be aware of, especially how they teach Islam to their children, to the next generations. Also importantly, when you do dawah towards other Muslims, but also to non-Muslims, simply giving a text, for example, like a Quran translation, is not simply giving the Islamic worldview to the other. The Islamic worldview is always larger than a single text. So of course, the Quran takes up the most important place within the Islamic worldview as a source. But at the same time, the Quran itself, of course, doesn't fill up the theoretical worldview completely. So simply reading the Quran is not the same as reading the Islamic worldview. After 9/11, the sales of Quran translations went up because people thought that reading the Quran is the same thing as reading the Islamic worldview. To understand the motivations and intentions of those they did not understand. That's not, of course, how it is. Also, simply asking a Muslim colleague, hey, why do you do this? Most Muslims, of course, are not experts of the Islamic worldview, but also they will not be a full representative in their lives of the Islamic worldview. And this is very important to understand when you are trying to analyze the Islamic worldview as a professional academic, but as a researcher, but also for every other Muslim out there. You have to understand how difficult it is to fully grasp and embrace the Islamic worldview. So one of the things that Vroom also emphasizes when we move from the personal or the personal worldview, the personal construct of a worldview, where Islam can inhabit as a dominant factor, towards Islam itself as a worldview tradition, as a large worldview, as a meta system of thought. So Vroom says, worldview is about insight into life and into the ideals it takes to live the human life well. So a worldview tradition, a religion like Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, is a pluriform tradition. So it is multiplex. It has a multiplicity in it. It has different ways to express itself. It has, especially because it has a history, it has a very dynamic form of history. It has different, it is expressed through different languages. It is, so there are things that make it recognizable for everybody. But at the same time, it has a multiplicity to it. So again, therefore, if you look at the Islamic worldview, what type of dynamic are you looking at? Yeah. So it's a pluriform tradition of groups of people. So it's a live tradition. A religion that lives is a religion that is carried by people that are alive itself. A tradition is not simply theory. A religion is not simply scripture. A religion is something that is lived by people. So it is a pluriform tradition of groups of people who pass on definite insights on life, ideals, norms, and values by means of certain organizations. A worldview is pluriform and has variety. So it has multiple orientations within the worldview itself. It is dynamic and it also undergoes various developments through historical events, but also by through interaction with the insights of other worldview traditions. A large part of the Kalamic tradition was formed, of the Islamic theology, was formed through the interactions with Christians and Buddhists, with the interaction between Zoroastrians, the Manichaeans. So these interactions help to formulate the Islamic worldview, help to formulate, to express the Islamic worldview, how to construct it as a theory itself. So, for example, one of the most important discussions within Kalam text, in Ilm al-Kalam text, Islamic theological text, is, for example, the proof of prophethood. How do you prove the need for prophets? Now, one of the most important opponents within Islamic theological texts are, for example, Buddhists, who technically claim that you can have scripture, but the idea of prophets are not necessary within the Buddhist worldview. So they are taken as an example of the other tradition that has an opposite view on prophethood, on the need for prophethood. So the way Buddhists express their idea of prophethood, their rejection of prophethood, is, and the Islamic tradition, the Islamic theology, responded to the way the Buddhist tradition rejected prophethood. So there's always this dynamic interaction with other worldviews, with other worldview traditions. How can you identify worldview and, for example, simply distinguish it from ideology, political opinions, political ideas, and from for example, from science itself? Things as science, things as different methodologies, philosophical methods. So when is a philosophy, when is a religion, when is a spirituality, when it becomes really a worldview? Now, one of these perspectives was developed by two Dutch scholars, Heijmans and Smaling, who said technically any real worldview answers 5 main questions. So first of all, it answers issues around aesthetics. What is beauty? What is something that is ugly? Questions surrounding ethics. What is good and evil? Questions surrounding ontology. So how does everything exist? But also how do they exist? The idea of epistemology. How do we know? What are their theories about knowledge? What is knowledge? How can we know things? How do we pass on knowledge? How can we make something a tradition? And then how does this create identity? So how does these formulate a strategy in how identities are formed? How does it answer the question of what are we? Who can we be? If we combine this also with another idea of how worldviews are constructed, is by the British scholar of religious studies, Ninian Smart. He says technically any real worldview has 7 dimensions. So it has a practical or ritual element, which in Islam is expressed by the ibadat. You know, the idea of salah, the idea of Ramadan, Siyam, the idea of Hajj, pilgrimage. These are the ritual elements of Islam that make it very distinct. It also has experiential, emotional, psychological aspects, like, for example, different forms of spiritual traditions, the idea of tasawwuf, the idea of the Sufi traditions, and how different ways of how different expressions of Islam also create emotional identities. How if you recite the Quran, how this provides a type of spiritual experience. But also, for example, that you can feel guilty about something that Islam makes you aware of, like this is a sin, or this is where you failed to do something that would please God or that would please Allah. So therefore, you have this emotional experience as well. It creates specific, distinct emotional experiences. It has, of course, very narrative and mythic elements into it. The idea how it views history, how Muslims created history, how it has specific approaches towards history, like, for example, the Qisas al-Anbiya, the stories of the prophets, alayhi salam. The idea of doctrine and philosophy, of course, aqidah, kalam, so theology and philosophy, the idea of falsafa and hikmah, wisdom traditions, the hikam, of course, ethical and legal concepts, sharia, adab, qanun, social and institutional elements like madrasa, the mosque, courtroom, but also the caliphate. And also how this is expressed to material things like buildings, different types of art, clothing, cultural expressions, calligraphy, all these things that really distinguish the Islamic worldview. None of these you can find in other worldviews in the way you find it in Islam. Therefore, also, and the worldview tradition, especially in its theological and philosophical expressions, is also very coherent theory. So for a Muslim, as from a person, so a Muslim that is constructed in his own personal worldview, that tries to infuse them himself or herself with the Islamic worldview as a tradition. Of course, is Aqidah, theology, and philosophy takes up a very important space within the personal worldview of a Muslim. So therefore also Islamic theology and Islamic philosophy and also Islamic legal theory, which is very much grounded within Islamic theology itself, discusses divine nature. So that Allah has an essence, that Allah has attributes, the way Allah interacts, how God interacts with physical nature, cosmology, with the universe, and also how this therefore explain human nature and the position of humans within existence itself. Apart from the personal Muslim perspective and the Islamic worldview as a theoretical tradition, there's also, of course, if you combine these two, so if you combine the Islamic worldview as a theoretical tradition, as a historical tradition. But if you combine them, of course, with humans itself, with Muslims, with their own personal worldviews, which is dominantly Islam, but also has other ethnic and cultural elements into it. Language, Urdu, Arabic, Persian, Bahasi, and so on and so on. Different ways of material in their surroundings that creates different type of clothing, different type of arts, different type of buildings. If you live in a climate where it rains more, your building's going to be different than if you live in a climate which is very dry. So where you live, what type of languages you have, are part of your Muslim expression, of your Muslim worldview, your personal worldview. If you combine the Islamic worldview as a theoretical worldview, it's a traditional worldview, and combine it with the Muslim constructs of worldviews, if you combine them, you get this very dynamic social element to Islam. And one of the things that is very dominant in Islamic studies, in the anthropology of Islam, the history of Islam, is that Islam is the most multi-diverse, multicultural religion out there. Although, for example, Christianity is in this time and in the last century, in the multitude of centuries, has been the dominant religion in the history of contemporary Earth. In the last 2,000 years of the history of Christianity, in the last 1,500 years, it has been the dominant religion on Earth, and it is so still today. But Islam, when Islam came up, in the last 1,000 years, it has become the second largest religion in the world, and it has stayed. It had the second place all that time for the last millennia. And there's of course these ideas that if we see this drop in adherence to Christianity, what we do see is this continuing rise in adherence to Islam as a religion, therefore that Muslims will become the dominant group in the world, the majority group in the world. But already for the last millennia, the majority of Islam, of Muslims social groups, has been defined by this deep diversity and multiculturality. So one of the things that scholars, both Muslim scholars and non-Muslim scholars of Islam, one of the things they are constantly confronted with is this diversity, is this complexity. So when you want to understand the Islamic worldview and Muslims as adherents and representatives of the Islamic worldview, you're confronted with things like Hodgson is saying here. Marshall Hodgson is saying Islam is unique among the religious traditions for the diversity of peoples that have embraced it. So even though Islam is the secondary religion, the second religion when it comes to the amount of people, the number of people adhering to it, it is the most diverse religion. It has the most culturally diverse groups of adherents. So Arnold also emphasized this. Among the major civilizational worlds of pre-modern times, Islam was no doubt also the religion that was most open towards cultural diversity. It was the most multi-societal. Eichelman emphasized, for example, the main challenge for the study of Islam is to describe how its universalistic or abstract principles have been realized in various social and historical contexts without representing Islam as a seamless essence on the one hand, or as a plastic congeries of beliefs and practice on the other. So how do you reconcile the fact that you can say there is a coherent Islamic worldview, but at the same time, it is expressed by this multi-diversity, this multiplexity of cultures around the world that so there is an Islam, but there are also Islams in this way, cultural Islams. How do you reconcile these two? Imagine how difficult that is for a non-Muslim, but also, for example, for a convert as me. In the beginning, when I converted to Islam, I was in Holland. The three dominant groups that are Muslim are the Moroccans, Turks, and Indonesians that are present here in Holland. So I was trying to figure out Islam as a worldview, but at the same time, I could only engage with the Moroccan expression of Islam, with the Turkish expression of Islam, and with the Indonesian expression of Islam. And I could not understand how to distinguish Islam from being Moroccan, from being Turkish, from being Indonesian. It's very and also because for an insider, a Moroccan itself could not detach Islam from being Moroccan. So one of the things that started to attract me as a convert were these modern expressions of Islam, like Salafism, but also really modernistic and postmodernistic ideas of Islam that claimed that they were expressing Islam in a way that was without culture. But technically, that does not exist. Every expression of Islam goes through a human, and every human has a culture. So there is almost no way to have a non-cultural expression of Islam. So every time you're engaging with other Muslims, you are engaging Muslims that have a type of cultural expression, even in language. That I use English now to express Islam, to explain Islam, or I use Dutch, then through using that language, you are using a cultural medium to express Islam, to explain it. So it's always a cultural mediated form of Islam that is expressed. So this is a problem for outsiders, for non-Muslims, but it is also very much a problem on the insides for converts like me, but also for a lot of non-convert Muslims. It has become more and more difficult to try to understand what is exactly the Islamic worldview, and when is my conformity to Islam good enough? When do I live according to an orientation within the Islamic worldview, which satisfies God, which pleases God, which pleases Allah? It's very difficult. So again, worldview suggests more unity than it possesses. It is not, especially from a personal expression and Muslims as a social group expression. It is not a coherent whole. It is a bit, because you are trying to express different orientations, different elements of the Islamic worldview in your life constantly. So you're constantly juggling with different elements. And same thing in cultures. Different Muslim cultures are emphasizing different aspects of the Islamic worldview within their culture. Yeah, it is therefore configuration of elements. Some of them are more sometimes tightly and other times more loosely connected to the theoretical Islam, the theory of the Islamic tradition. Yeah. Islam is one of the most diverse worldviews existing. It's has one of the most diverse group of adherents. So this diversity, both in worldview and adherence, creates this contradictory variety of Islams. How you as a Muslim and as a non-Muslim experience Islam. So how do you navigate such a diverse worldview? Now, if you look at, for example, if we try to map it out, if we create a sort of, okay, this is the Islamic worldview, so you have to understand it as a multiplex worldview. Then you have all these different systems within it. So you have, for example, the majority group is Sunnism, that I try to express in the middle of it. You have different groups within it. The Hanafi are the majority group within Sunnism, has always been the historical dominant group. The Maliki as a second, the Shafi as a third, the Hanbali as a fourth, and also, if you want to, and the Dahiri school, but also, of course, died out expressions like Sufyan al-Thawri's Sunnism, his fiqh school, the Jariri of Tabri, Ibn Jarir al-Tabri, the famous Mufassir, the famous tafsir scholar, also was known to have his own fiqh school as being a Sunni school within Islam. But in the end, we only ended through the wisdom of Allah. Only 4 of them became dominant as fiqh orientations, as legal and ethical orientations within the Islamic worldview, within Sunnism. Probably also simply because these 4 Sunni orientations within the Islamic worldview provide enough navigation for the diversity of mankind to navigate themselves within the Islamic worldview. Yeah? You also, of course, have Shiism that represent between 10 to 20% of Muslims in the world. And in Shiism, you have the Imamiyya and other the different groups within the Shiism itself that express different schools. Outside of Sunnism and Shiism, you have the Ibadi school and other schools that also exist. That in a certain way express the Islamic worldview, or at least adhere major elements within the Islamic worldview. So if you look at from a, you can ask different questions and try to map out these different orientations within Islamic theology. So, for example, within the Sunni perspective, from the Sunni perspective, but also the theological schools that were very close to Sunnism, like the Murji'a, like the Khawarij, like the Mu'tazila, that were very close to the Sunni perspective, especially because the Murji and the Mu'tazila in fiqh, they adhere to a Sunni school. So the majority of the Mu'tazila and the majority of the Murji'a were Hanafi in fiqh. So this is also the reason why they were very close towards the Sunni theology itself. If you look at the Khawarij died out as a theological school, but they transformed into the Ibadi school, which I just mentioned. And the Ibadi school also started to develop their own usul al-fiqh, which is very close to the Shafi'i concepts of fiqh. It's very close to the Shafi'i ideas. But also, when it comes to theology, the Khawarij and the Ibadi were also very close to the Mu'tazila. So you can see there's this very complexity. And for me, the Hanafi-Maturidi always stuck out in the way they balance reason and revelation, how they balance human philosophy and revealed theology, and how these two they try to construct the Islamic worldview that very much stays close to human nature and the needs of human nature to be navigated in the world, which is for me also expressed why the Hanafi-Maturidi have always been the dominant majority group within the Islamic worldview itself. The same thing you can see in the Hanafi, how the Hanafi, in their fiqh expression, created a form of dynamics among the different schools, which the way they try to understand these sources of law and the way the dynamics of the Islamic sources of law, how their usul al-fiqh, their legal theory, how their legal theory, their usul al-fiqh, their philosophy of law, how it not only stayed very close towards scripture, their scriptural theology, but also very much stayed close to, again, the needs and structures of human nature. The way psychology needs a form of orientating itself to express itself. So how do you create a theoretical framework for Islam that is also livable, that also can be lived by people? And one of the things that for me became very logical when I started to study different forms of usul al-fiqh, when I started to study for different forms of ilm kalam, the Hanafi-Maturidi school always I saw it as one of the school that stayed close to the scriptural expressions, the Quran and Sunnah, and at the same time stayed very close to the anthropology, to human nature and human psychology, and made it very livable. And also, and that's the thing, very much teachers. This is something now I go to my story to Islam. How I ended up choosing So, am I hearable again? Is my audio back up again? Yes. Okay. Alhamdulillah. So, for me personally, how I ended up being Hanafi-Maturidi had to do very much with my own psychology, with my own mindset, and my own ideas about human nature, my ideas of philosophy, how I view the world. But also, I could see it in Islamic history. For me, I see also that the reason why the Hanafi-Maturidi always were the dominant school and still are the dominant school in the Islamic worldview with the majority of Muslim adherents, for me also it shows how the Hanafi-Maturidi always stayed very close to human nature and try to keep their understanding of the Islamic worldview as very livable, as very applicable for Muslims, and therefore made it easy for Muslims to conform to the Islamic worldview through the Hanafi-Maturidi orientation. So first of all, if you want to understand conversion, and I'm going to do this quickly because I only have a couple of minutes left. So there's in religious studies they have different ways of how to understand conversion, how people convert to a different religion or different expression within their religion. And there have been multiple studies on this. And one of the best ones is by Louis Rambo, an American scholar. And the way he explains religious conversion, he says, first of all, you have 5 different forms of conversion. So first of all, apostasy, to renounce affiliation to a religion, or technically for the majority of all religions. So most apostates either become, for example, from Islam, either become Christian or they become atheist. And this is a form of conversion. So conversion theory can help us to understand why people become apostates. Same thing with, if you want to understand how people start to re-engage their religion, become reborn. This is called intensification. They start to re-engage their religion after a lapse. So if you want to do dawah towards fellow Muslims that are very lapsing in their religion, again, conversion theory can help a lot in this to understand it. Same thing also, how do different groups shift from one, let's say, perspective to another, for how a large Muslim, for example, if you have a Muslim majority society that became very secularized, for example, because they lived under a very secular regime, like Iran was under the Shah, or with a communist regime, how then slowly that Muslim group start to re-engage as a group. They start to intensify, re-engage, and become reborn again as a group. That the whole group start to reorientate again towards a specific orientation within their religion, a certain denomination. Then you also have the institutional transition. So that is within the specific religion. Like, for example, a Catholic becomes a Protestant, or a Sunni becomes a Shi'i. Or like, for example, what I first was a Salafi, because the only literature I was reading and the Muslims I was engaging with after my conversion were that had the Salafi orientation. Then that became very unattractive to me, because it felt very unlivable. It was very difficult for me to see this overlap between my psychology and human nature and the Salafi orientation. So it was for me, I couldn't live conformity to the Salafi orientation. And I started to look for other orientations, and I ended up with very different forms of modern ideas, Islamic modern groups, postmodern groups, Islamic progressives and others, Quranists. I started to look at all these different of modern movements that fascinated me. And eventually, after a couple of years, when I really started to study Islam academically, I started to understand and be attracted towards the Hanafi-Maturidi orientation. But of course, before I converted, I was brought up as a Catholic and as a Christian, and I became Muslim. This is what you call tradition transition. So you convert, that's number 5. You convert from one religion to a different religion. So that's a shift in the worldview. With 4, you have a shift in orientations, but in 5, you have a shift in worldviews. And this is the whole point, how I want to end this talk, is I originally 20 years ago, so this happened in, I got a Quran translation. I was studying biochemistry at that time, and a Muslim student, a fellow student who was Muslim, from a Moroccan background, a Dutch Moroccan, we always had really nice engagements about God and the world, and we were young, we were 18, 19, and he suddenly asked me, you know what, Arnold, can I give you my Quran translation? Because I'm curious how you would respond to it. And this is in September 2002. So this is a year after 9/11. But at that time, we really did not really discuss 9/11. 9/11 wasn't a factor in my thinking about Islam at that time. And he gave me a Dutch Quran translation. I started to read it. And within 2 months, I was like, this is something special. I grew up as a Catholic. I read the Bible, parts of it a bit, but I never had this very personal connection with God. And in the Quran, one of the things that really attracted me to the Quran is the way how God really directly talks to me. I felt really a very personal engagement with God in the Quran. So after a while, I was like, I believe in this text to be from God. What do I do now? So, okay, I did the Shahada, alhamdulillah, I did the Shahadatain. I converted to Islam, and then nobody explained to me the different orientations within Islam. So for the first year, I never heard the term Sunnism, Shiism, or anything else. People simply said, this is the Quran, and oh yeah, also our Prophet ﷺ also had these different ways of explaining things, and these are captured in what we call the Sunnah, these are Hadith. You also have to believe in these and these and these and these. And it was a very simplistic approach to Islam. It was a very simplistic Salafi approach to Islam. I was like, okay, whatever, and I just followed it. I learned how to pray, but without understanding the different fiqh, for example, the different schools of fiqh that explain the different ways you can pray in Islam, the different details you have, the different focuses you have. So when I went to Turkish mosques, and Turks are Hanafi, okay, I learned to pray according to the Hanafi school without knowing it was Hanafi. And then I went to a Moroccan mosque and they were Maliki and they did it differently. And I got confused and nobody explained it to me. And a lot of converts have this issue, but also a lot of non-convert Muslims, young people growing up, if they go to different mosques, they also have this sort of, okay, why do Turks do it like this? Why do Pakistani do it like this? Why do Arabs do it, Iraqis do it like this? Why do Syrians do it like this? Why do Indonesians do it like this? No, it's very difficult to understand all these different orientations. So I started to drift because for me, I didn't know I had, in a sense, to understand an orientation and make it my own. Because being Dutch, I was like, I cannot be fully Turkish, I cannot be fully Moroccan, and I could not distinguish between the fiqh and the kalam orientations that are captured within the Turkish Muslim identity or within the Moroccan Muslim identity. I couldn't distinguish the Maliki Ash'ari perspectives or the Hanafi-Maturidi perspectives with the Turkish Muslims. So it was very difficult for me. So, and of course, I learned Islam autodidactically. I listened a bit to lectures, I listened to khutbahs, I talked with different imams, different Muslims, and I started to read up, because one of the things as well, I grew up as a postmodern Western Christian. So we are taught to be very self-taught, to be autodidactic. So I started to buy books, I just started to read about Islam. And simply by simply reading about Islam on my own, I started to try to construct my own orientation. So for almost a decade, I became 100 different Muslims, because I constantly drifted from orientation to orientation without really understanding what I was doing. And then I became confronted with different Muslims, academics, that said to me, you need to, you really need, you're smart enough to go to university. I did other studies before. You really need to do Islamic studies, and that will help you to understand this diversity of Islamic thought. And then you can navigate among these different orientations. So eventually I did that. I went to Leiden University. I studied Islamic theology there. And I started to read a lot about the Mu'tazila and the Ash'ari, and also the Maturidi. And then I started to read the tafsir of Maturidi. And that changed everything for me. And I started to think about, why am I attracted towards, I was first of all also very much attracted to the Mu'tazila, because of course they're seen as very rationalistic, although they are highly dogmatic. But when I started to read the Hanafi-Maturidi, I was like, this is it. This makes sense to me. Why? Why is it makes sense to me? And one of the things as well that, and I will wrap up now in the last sentences. One of the things that I started to understand is I cannot understand the Hanafi-Maturidi perspective simply by reading it on my own or through the Western academic perspective. And this is how I decided to study it also traditionally. And one of the things that, alhamdulillah, when I started to decide I need help in this, I was asked to go to the UK, to England, to the United Kingdom, to be part of different conferences with also traditional scholars. And there I met Mufti Amjad Muhammad from Bradford, a Deoband scholar. And he's the one that I asked him, can I be your student? And he's like, yes. And he's the one that really helped me to understand the Hanafi-Maturidi perspective, and also how the Islamic worldview is grounded in the Quran and Sunnah, is grounded in tradition in Isnad, and also very much how fiqh, the Hanafi mindset, is focused how to make Islam livable. And through this, I started to search out more scholars that could teach me, scholars in Turkey, and I started to engage more with Hanafi-Maturidi scholars. And this is also how I met Sheikh Amin. And I'm very much blessed to have to be studying with him. And he's the one that also constantly emphasized how the Islamic worldview, the Hanafi-Maturidi perspective, makes sense and helps us to understand how to navigate the world itself through the Islamic worldview, from the Hanafi-Maturidi, the Sunni majority orientation. And this is also important why we need institutions. Like I work, for example, at the Islamic University of Rotterdam, which is an academic seminary, but also why you need institutions like Darul Iftā, because without specialists, without teachers that can guide you into the traditional worldview, that helps you understand what is an orientation, you simply cannot self-teach you that. You cannot learn that by simply listening to YouTube lectures, even though you are listening to good scholars. You cannot self-construct your orientation. You need real guidance in this. And the tradition always knew this. So the tradition created ways for you how to adopt and to understand that orientation in your life through traditional teachings. And therefore you need professional institutions like Darul Iftā, like the Islamic University of Rotterdam, like Cambridge Muslim College, that helps you to understand how to connect knowledge and tradition and to live it. And therefore, it's very much important that you need not simply an academic institution. Like I, for example, at Leiden University. Leiden University helped me to discover the Hanafi-Maturidi perspective, but it could not teach it to me as an orientation. You need professional centers, institutions for this, like Darul Iftā. And this is why they are so important, and why that also that now Darul Iftā has been granted the possibility to create academic degrees is so important, because then you can finally have this connection between modern academic studies and traditional studies that can help you understand the Islamic worldview and teach you how to navigate it as an orientation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and sincere and personal explanation of your journey within Islam. So I'll ask a question, and then I'll open the floor for other questions. So my question is, as you said, part of being Muslim is struggling to personalize and live the mekarimul akhlaq, the virtues of the Prophet ﷺ. But another aspect is also promoting Islam. So, what can you tell us about, as from your own experiences, what are certain things that would make us promote Islam better to non-Muslims, and what are certain things perhaps we should avoid?
First of all, you need to know yourself. So it starts with you. It starts with your own character, your own personality, and you need to understand what is the reason why I adhere to Islam. One of the things that a lot of people, of course, I understand the attraction. So a lot of people constantly ask me, Muslims, tell me your conversion story. But one of the things, and I understand that attraction, but the thing is, technically it's useless for most people, because every convert will tell you they had their own factors, their own mixed bag of things that made them convert to Islam. So conversion stories themselves are attractive, but partially they're a bit useless for the non-specialist, although in religious studies we do see patterns why people convert. And that mainly has to do with different psychologies and lifestyles and backgrounds. There's also this sort of age gap where in that gap, so most people convert between their 15 and their 25th. So when they're 25. So this is sort of the age of conversion, which overlaps with adolescence. So that's the age of transformation. So it also has a lot to do with age. It has to do with psychology. It has to do with, for example, for me as a Christian, when I was a Christian, I believed in God, I believed in creation, I believed in scripture, I believed in prophecy. So the Quran and Muhammad alayhi salam can easily be fitted in added on to my Christianity. But for example, if you have somebody who's an atheist, he doesn't have that. So there's more things that the person has to accept before it could enter the Islamic worldview. So that is one of the things that first of all, you have to know that. When it also comes to something, and with knowing yourself, it's also very much important to understand. Don't ask, okay, you can ask converts, well, how you converted, but that becomes very tiring for most converts because you're always seen as the other, as sort of this enigma, but also that it's not the correct question, because it is not something you share. So if you're a non-convert, you technically, the conversion itself is not something an experience you can understand and share in. But there is an element of converts that's exactly the same for non-converts. And that is the thing and that is something I constantly also tell my students at the Islamic University. Don't ask me how I converted. Ask me how I stayed Muslim, but also how did I navigate within Islam, within the Islamic worldview. Because those two elements of how did I stay within the Islamic worldview and how did I find my place in it? How did I how did I navigate towards a specific orientation? Those are the things that converts and non-converts share with one another. So there are two things. There's, first of all, are you dealing with a non-Muslim? Then you are trying to attract that person to the Islamic worldview, so you have to take in a lot of things in mind. But also when you are trying to convert a fellow Muslim to dawah to a fellow Muslim to live a better life, you need also to understand that it has more to do with an inner navigation.
Any questions from the floor? Any questions online? So there's one question, says there's an increased appreciation of Maturidi and Ash'ari point of view among Western converts, provided a large proportion of which started as Salafis. Why do you think the reasons are? So the question is, why is it that many converts start as Salafis and then afterwards go towards the more Maturidi, Ash'ari, or Sufi perspectives?
Very good question. And I've seen this myself as well, not only from my own personal journey, but also when it comes to, I see it also with a lot of other converts. That has to do with two things. That has to do, when you enter the Islamic worldview, you enter it in the way you were. So the Shahada is only the beginning. It's technically is the opening of transformation, but you're not changed yet. So when you enter the Islamic worldview, you enter as you are. So I was a postmodern Christian and I became a postmodern Muslim in a sense. So, and I entered the Islamic worldview like, here I am, let's play. And the thing was, what happened, of course, that the first ones that responded to me in a way that I could recognize were Salafis that combine a lot of modern and postmodern discourse. They emphasize autodidactic elements. So you can teach yourself Islam. You don't need anybody else. You don't need external authorities. You don't need scholars really to understand Islam, because every Muslim can be like the Sahaba, and every Muslim can simply understand the Quran and Sunnah in a very direct way. And you don't need this large scholarly tradition to understand Islam. And that is, in a way, that's a very modern, even / postmodern approach towards Islam, that you don't, in a sense, don't need any clerical priestly authorities to understand it. And so, so when you enter the Islamic worldview, you enter it as a modernist, as a postmodern human, a lot of Western converts. So the Salafis are the first one that sort of speak your language, that are very close to your psychology. And one of the things why I entered then the Hanafi-Maturidi, like I just said, one of the things that I had to distinguish what is the modern element of me, what is the modernity in me, what is the postmodernity in me, and what is my psychology, what is my character, where I want to go to, and what do I trust? So what really has a historicity that represents a very grounded historical approach towards Islam, that is not simply a modern invention, a very contemporary invention, like the Salafi perspective is, which is technically 200 years old. And the Hanafi-Maturidi has one of the oldest histories within Islamic thought, one of the most grounded. It has always been the majority perspective when it comes to numbers of Muslims being Hanafi. But also, like I said, it still also stayed very close to what I see as being human nature. So it respected also this, it was very open to diversity. So I think that also helps a lot of converts to also to stay themselves, but also become that new person through the Hanafi-Maturidi perspective.
There's a question from the floor.
Thank you for your presentation. What I just noticed that the word difficult kept coming in your lecture. Of course, there are a lot of difficulties and life is a hardship. How can we balance that with what is easy?
Now, the thing is, of course, that if you look at, like I said, when you look at fiqh, in the fiqh, of course, they try to, when it comes to the ahkam al-khamsa, the 5 levels of in the sense of obligation, of things that are permitted and things that are forbidden, and this spectrum already, this provided, because you have this sort of spectrum of do's and don'ts, it already very taps into the fact that you cannot have simply a very simplistic approach towards good and bad, wanted or unwanted, doable and non-doable. So this is something that already, something that was graded into the Islamic worldview, that you constantly had to have this multiplex approach, this diversity approach within the way you can apply Islam into your life. So it's not simply about seeking ease and seeking comfort, but the thing is that to apply the application of the Islamic worldview through rituals and through the mu'amalat, through the legal and ethical norms of the Sharia, but also, for example, to how do you, even if you can, the Maturidi have a very, for me, one of the best theories about why does evil exist. But when you're confronted with a child that dies because of leukemia, how do you connect theory and and your own personal psychology experience of the world? So difficulty and ease has a lot to do with your own psychology. If you look at the way how the Sunni, but also the Shi'i, created this diversity, this spectrum of how to deal with life, that in a sense it is unnecessary to go outside of the Islamic worldview to deal with life, to live. And that is something for me which shows why Islam became a dominant world religion, and is, inshallah, probably becoming, with the numbers, becoming the dominant world religion, especially because of that anything that life throws at you, of course we believe, of course, it's the qadr Allah, but let's say life experience throws at you, it can fit within the Islamic worldview because of constantly that you can move among this spectrum within the Sunni theological and juristic orientations.
Assalamu alaikum. Thanks for the talk. You obviously used a lot of references here that maybe the non-specialists don't know. Many of us often use Quran and Hadith despite not having the Salafi orientation. We're often trained in that. So are there some ayat of Quran or some Hadith that you could help us orient some of the remarks on worldview, for example?
As a way that points towards the idea of that worldview is an acceptable category for Islam, or?
Sure, that's one way of saying it.
Yeah. A very good question. There are different works on this. So one of them is by Alpasalan Akeinche. You have also by Atas and others that have used these terms itself, Izutsu. And when it comes to, of course, there are different Quran verses that refer to it. The one that comes up to me is that the one that you have the signs within, in the horizons within yourself. So there are different Quran verses and Hadith that show that, in a sense, you have a sort of map that you navigate to understand the Islamic worldview, that are pointing within and pointing without, which has always been emphasized also by the theological and Sufi and the spiritual tradition, the Sufi tradition.
We have another question online. Is there a roadmap for a better navigation for converts? Salafism is very attractive, especially in UK and Holland. So that's the question. A roadmap for converts.
I was at last year in December. We had a large conference in Turkey, in Konya, where we're discussing conversion and converts and the difficulties arising around it. And one of the things I've been developing together with other Muslim scholars is there is a sort of roadmap how to understand conversion from an Islamic perspective, and also the conceptual difficulties, psychological difficulties, the social difficulties that arise out of the conversion process. People, of course, that become detached from their families or friends, lose their jobs, but also, especially, that is the difficulty of or navigating in the Islamic worldview and in Islamic theory, Islamic knowledge, Muslim cultures. So we're trying to do multiple things together with the Diyanet, the Ministry of Religious Affairs, to create different forms of literature and information, websites and videos about conversion and all these aspects surrounding it.
Thank you very much for your time and for this wonderful presentation. Jazakumullah khairan.
Yakum, thank you so much for Darul Qasim and especially Sheikh Amin for inviting me. And I hope it was beneficial. And may Allah forgive me for any mistakes. And Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.